millionaire's arrogance nearly cost the life of his special daughter. But at the very last moment, the maid did the impossible. Stay until the end to witness the powerful transformation in this story, and subscribe now to the channel to keep receiving heart-touching stories. The city of Newport Hills, known for its imposing mansions and tree-lined streets, seemed to reflect the luxury of those who lived there. Among them stood the property of Richard Coleman, one of the most influential businessmen in the region, owner of the powerful corporation Coleman Dynamics, specialized in high-end technology and supplier of advanced systems to international companies. The mansion, surrounded by meticulously kept gardens, represented not only wealth but also the coldness of a man who believed that power and money were enough to dictate all the rules. Inside, every detail seemed calculated to impress. Crystal chandeliers, marble staircases, and silent hallways that echoed more emptiness than life. The tall, imposing gate did not only protect the residents but also symbolized the distance Richard maintained from the real world. To outsiders, that life was a dream. To those inside, it was nothing more than a suffocating and frozen routine. In his daily routine, Richard passed by the employees as if they were invisible, rarely uttering a word that was not a dry order or a sharp criticism. To him, every worker was just a replaceable piece, faceless and storyless, disposable like any office object. Among them was Isabella Costa, a humble woman who worked as a maid in the mansion. In the millionaire's eyes, she was nothing more than just another servant, someone who should simply fulfill her duty without ever expecting recognition. Isabella, however, carried in her tired eyes a strength Richard could never comprehend. Her life had been marked by losses, sacrifices, and the constant need to reinvent herself in the face of hardship. At the same time she endured her employer's harsh commands, she found strength in her faith and in her hope that one day she would be seen as someone beyond the blue uniform she wore. On that sunny Monday morning, while Richard reviewed million-dollar contracts in his glass-walled office, Isabella walked quietly through the corridors, carrying her buckets and cleaning cloths. The heavy silence of the house was broken only by the distant sound of classical music he insisted on playing, as if trying to give his loneliness an air of sophistication. Outside, the garden blossomed, but inside the mansion reigned an atmosphere of austerity, where even laughter was muffled by formality. Isabella felt that weight every day, but she had learned to transform discomfort into resilience. Observing the luxuries around her, she never felt envy, only the certainty that true greatness was not found in marble or gold, but in how people treated one another. What Richard did not know was that soon, his entire empire of pride and arrogance would be confronted by a simple gesture, one capable of changing his life forever. Isabella Costa lived in a small working-class neighborhood in Brookfield, almost an hour away from Newport Hills. Her home was modest, with simple walls painted in a faded shade of blue, but filled with memories and warmth. Every detail there reflected her daily struggle to provide a dignified life for her son, Matteo, just 9 years old. She woke before sunrise, prepared a simple breakfast, and slipped a small lunch into the boy's backpack before walking him to the community school. The bus ride to Richard's mansion was long and tiring, but Isabella made the journey every day with resignation, knowing that this job, despite the humiliations, was the only way to support her home. In her eyes there was fatigue, but also a quiet determination that kept her strong in the face of difficulties. Even on her most exhausting days, she found energy in Matteo's laughter, reminding herself that every sacrifice was for him. At times, gazing at the morning sky, she whispered silent prayers, asking for strength to face yet another day. While many saw her only as the maid, Isabella carried within her stories no one there could imagine. Coming from a humble family in the countryside, she lost her parents early and learned, still as a teenager, to work in households to survive. She never had luxury, but she had values that money could never buy: honesty, loyalty, and love. When she married, she believed her life would change, but soon found herself alone after her husband abandoned her, leaving her with only the courage to move forward and raise Matteo. Within her were invisible scars, but also an almost indestructible strength. It was that strength that allowed her to endure every harsh word from Richard, every look of contempt, without letting bitterness corrupt her. In many moments, when she thought of giving up, she remembered her son sleeping peacefully, and that gave her strength again. Isabella knew that her true wealth was not material, but the hope of building a better future for Matteo. That hope was her shield against the hardness of the world. In the mansion, Isabella was invisible to many, but not to all. Some employees admired her quiet courage, seeing in her an example of resilience. Even little Emily Coleman, just 5 years old, Richard's special daughter, felt drawn to the tenderness of that simple woman. Isabella, secretly, nurtured a special affection for the girl, who often seemed lonely amid so much luxury. Whenever she could, she offered a smile, a gentle gesture, even at the risk of being reprimanded by her employer. Deep inside, she knew there was no greater greatness than treating others with humanity. For Isabella, each workday was not just a battle against exhaustion, but a reaffirmation of who she was. A woman who, despite all the hardships, still stood tall. And in the depths of her heart, there was an inexplicable feeling that Emily was destined to cross her path for a greater reason. As if life itself were preparing something that would change both their destinies forever. At just 5 years old, Emily Coleman lived surrounded by luxuries most children would never know. Yet she carried in her eyes the loneliness of someone longing for what money could not give. The mansion's grand and silent hallways seemed immense and intimidating to her, often pushing her to retreat into small corners of the house with her stuffed toys. Unlike what her father believed, Emily did not need more imported dolls or expensive dresses. She needed warmth, a sincere hug, a presence that gave her security. Diagnosed early with a neurological condition that required constant care, she had become even more vulnerable to Richard's emotional absence. Her father, consumed by business and appearances, saw his daughter more as a delicate responsibility than as a child who longed for love. And so, Emily grew up within gilded walls, but with a heart thirsty for true affection. Behind her timid smile and delicate way of playing, Emily also carried a silent wisdom, as if she understood things the adults around her could not grasp. When she looked into Isabella's eyes, she felt something different. No judgment, no hurry, none of the emptiness she so often saw in her father's gaze. Isabella, even in uniform and always busy with chores, would pause for a few seconds to ask how Emily was or simply to return a genuine smile. These simple gestures had immense value to the girl, making her believe she was not completely alone. And each time she received that kindness, Emily clung to it like someone who finds a ray of light in the darkness. That silent connection began to blossom, though Richard never noticed, for his eyes were always fixed on contracts, meetings, and numbers. The nannies hired to care for Emily came and went, always replaced by new professionals who could not withstand the coldness of the house or the absence of her father. Isabella, though never paid for such a role, was the only constant in the girl's life. When Emily cried quietly, hidden in the garden or in her room, it was the sound of the maid's footsteps that brought her comfort. For she knew a kind word or a protective gesture would follow. With each passing day, that bond grew stronger, like invisible roots weaving through both their hearts. To Emily, Isabella was more than an employee. She was like a silent guardian, someone who never let her feel invisible. Deep down, Isabella also sensed there was something special in that bond. something that made her feel her work went far beyond cleaning the mansion. Fate, in its mysterious way, was already weaving the threads of a story that would forever change their lives. On that sunny afternoon, the Coleman mansion hosted important guests. Richard had organized a meeting with strategic partners of Coleman Dynamics, men and women in impeccable suits who roamed the luxurious halls as though they were walking through a showcase of power. Crystal glasses chimed with imported champagne, chandeliers reflected the golden light of sunset, and everything seemed carefully arranged to impress. Isabella moved quietly, cleaning subtle traces left by the event, carrying a tray discreetly so as not to draw attention. But to Richard, nothing escaped his demanding eye, and it was precisely in front of everyone, when he noticed a small water stain on the floor near the main table, that his anger turned on her. In a loud, harsh tone, he interrupted his conversation with the investors and, pointing at Isabella, unleashed words that cut through the air like sharp blades. "This is what I call incompetence," Richard bellowed, ignoring the awkward silence that instantly filled the room. The investors exchanged glances, some lowering their eyes, others holding back expressions of discomfort, but none dared to intervene. Isabella stood frozen, her face flushing with shame, while she gripped the tray tightly to keep it from slipping. Inside, her heart raced, not only from the humiliation but also from the fear of losing the only livelihood she had. For a moment, she thought of defending herself, of explaining that the stain had been caused by one of the careless guests, but she held back. She knew that, in Richard's eyes, any word would be interpreted as insolence. Her dignity tried to resist, but the feeling of being reduced to nothing in front of so many people weighed on her shoulders like an invisible chain. Emily, hidden behind the grand marble staircase, watched everything with tearful eyes. At just 5 years old, she understood more than her father imagined. To her, Isabella was not a servant. She was her secret friend, her silent protector. Seeing the woman who had comforted her so many times being humiliated in that way stirred a mix of sadness and indignation. The little girl wanted to run over, hug Isabella, and defend her, but her father's authoritarian presence paralyzed her. Inside her young heart, however, a seed of repulsion was born toward the way Richard treated people. While the guests tried to resume their conversations and Richard smiled as if nothing had happened, Emily curled up even more, feeling the weight of a loneliness that not even the grandest palace could ease. And that afternoon, Isabella learned that no matter how deep the well of humiliation, there were always eyes watching that could see her true greatness. In the days that followed the humiliation, Isabella kept the same resilient silence as always. She continued carrying out her duties with dedication, as if nothing had happened, but inside she carried the weight of Richard's words thrown at her in front of everyone. Her wounded pride burned in her soul, but her strength lay in refusing to let that resentment turn into hatred. Isabella knew resentment was a prison, and she preferred to carry invisible scars rather than become bitter. She clung to her routine like someone gripping a rope in the middle of a storm, believing that every small act of kindness still made a difference. Without realizing it, this self-control, this quiet posture of dignity, began to awaken in Emily an ever-growing admiration. The 5-year-old girl, observant and sensitive, saw in Isabella something her father lacked, the ability to be strong without crushing anyone. With every look, Emily perceived that this simple woman carried within her a greatness that not even the crystal chandeliers could overshadow. It was as if, in the face of pain, Isabella had learned how to become unbreakable. Emily began seeking out the Maid's company more and more. If before she approached only out of shyness and curiosity, now there was genuine trust. When Isabella was in the garden collecting fallen leaves, Emily would appear with her favorite doll and sit by her side, without needing to say much. Isabella, even knowing she could be reprimanded, allowed herself a few moments to play with the little girl, adjusting the doll's dress or inventing small stories to distract her. In those moments, Emily smiled truly, a pure, vibrant smile, so different from the rehearsed one she showed her father at business dinners. Their bond grew quietly, like a tree sending down roots unnoticed. Isabella found in Emily the sweetness that eased the fatigue of her soul, and Emily found in Isabella the steady presence she lacked at home. And in every detail of that bond, there was a seed of hope, as if fate wanted to prove that even in the coldest places, love could still bloom. One morning, Emily waited for her father to rush out to a meeting and then ran to the bedroom where Isabella was making the bed. With shining eyes, she handed her a drawing made with colored pencils. Two figures holding hands, one tall and one small, with a caption scrawled in uneven letters. "Me and you, Bella." Isabella held the paper for a few seconds, feeling her heart tighten. She did not cry, but a knot formed in her throat. That simple piece of paper was worth more than any jewel displayed in the mansion's halls. She knelt, looked into the little girl's eyes, and said softly, "Thank you, my little one. You are very special." Emily smiled and hugged her tightly, as if in that embrace she had found the home she did not even have within her own house. That innocent gesture revealed a deep bond, a trust so genuine that not even Richard's arrogance could erase it. In that moment, Isabella felt there was something greater at play, a silent calling to protect that child at any cost. That afternoon, the mansion was abuzz with an important meeting between Richard and several Coleman Dynamics investors. The grand hall was filled with serious conversations, wine glasses being served, and a business atmosphere so heavy it seemed to suffocate even the air. Richard, as always, was in his element, speaking with confidence, boasting about his latest contracts, and flaunting the power he so carefully cultivated. Meanwhile, Emily, bored and feeling invisible among the adults, slipped quietly through the side door toward the garden. No one noticed her absence, not even the babysitter on duty, who was distracted by her phone. The afternoon sun shimmered on the mansion's crystal blue pool water, inviting, yet dangerous for such a small child. Emily walked with short steps, clutching her doll against her chest, unaware of the danger awaiting her. In that moment, the calm surface concealed the tragedy that was about to unfold. Emily approached the edge of the pool, curiously staring at the glittering reflection of the water. Her doll slipped from her hands and fell into the pool, slowly sinking. Instinctively, she leaned forward to try and grab it, without thinking of the consequences. Then her feet lost balance on the slippery tiles, and in a swift motion, her small body plunged into the water. The garden's silence was broken by the splash, but inside the house no one heard. Emily began flailing, her tiny hands reaching for the surface, but her lack of coordination, compounded by her special condition, made the struggle even harder. Her wide eyes filled with panic as bubbles rose around her. The doll, now floating beside her, seemed like an ironic witness to the child's fight for survival. With each passing second, the scene turned into a silent nightmare, and the little girl's life became a flame on the verge of being extinguished. At that very moment, Isabella, who was gathering bed linens near the garden, heard an unusual sound. An almost maternal instinct made her drop everything and run toward the pool. When she saw Emily struggling in the water, the world seemed to stop for a second. Isabella's heart pounded, and she didn't think twice. She sprinted to the pool and, still in her uniform and shoes, dove in without hesitation. The cold water closed around her, but her only concern was reaching the child. She swam with all her strength, ignoring the weight of her soaked clothes, until she grabbed Emily's fragile arms. The girl coughed and swallowed water, but Isabella held her firmly, keeping her head above the surface. With difficulty, she swam to the edge and, in a desperate effort, managed to lift Emily out of the pool. Gasping, Isabella knelt on the wet ground, clutching the child against her chest. Emily cried softly, frightened, but alive, and in that desperate embrace, something powerful was born. Isabella had just risked her own life to save the daughter of a man who had never given her any value. The garden, once silent, now echoed with Emily's sobs and Isabella's labored breathing. Water dripped from her hair and soaked uniform, forming small puddles around the pool. Isabella trembled, not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline still surging through her body. Emily clung to her tightly, burying her face in her shoulder as if she never wanted to let go again. In that moment, there was no mansion, no social divide, no boss or maid. Only a woman who had risked everything to save a child. Isabella closed her eyes for a brief second, her heart racing, silently thanking God she had arrived in time. A wave of relief mixed with the terror of what could have happened had she been only seconds later. In that soaked embrace, there was more humanity than Richard had ever managed to show his daughter in her entire life. Inside the house, the meeting continued with speeches about numbers and financial projections, but fate willed that one of the glass doors suddenly swung open, exposing the scene in the garden. One of the investors interrupted Richard, pointing outside. When the millionaire turned his gaze, his heart froze. His daughter was in the maid's arms, drenched, crying, and with clear signs of having been in danger. Richard rushed outside, followed by the astonished stares of his guests, who now whispered in tones of shock. Reaching the garden, he saw Isabella kneeling on the ground, trying to soothe Emily with gentle words. The man, so accustomed to controlling everything, suddenly felt powerless and vulnerable in the face of what he was witnessing. For the first time, it wasn't him at the center of the scene, but the woman he had so often despised, now transformed into a heroine before his very eyes, and before the audience silently watching. Isabella, still breathless, lifted her gaze toward Richard. For a moment, silence hung between them. Emily, still trembling, clung tightly to the maid's hand as if afraid of losing her. Richard, paralyzed, didn't know what to say. His usual arrogance had given way to an uncomfortable void. He, the invincible businessman, had not been able to protect his own daughter. The one who had done so was the woman he had humiliated countless times, the one he never allowed even the dignity of raising her voice. The guests slowly drew closer, some trying to mask their astonishment, others visibly moved by the scene. Isabella, however, sought no recognition. She simply caressed Emily's wet hair and whispered, "It's all right, my little one, it's over now." And in that simple gesture, so pure and genuine, everyone understood. True greatness was not in Richard's power, but in the heart of the woman he had always underestimated. Richard Coleman stood frozen for several seconds, as if time itself had stopped before his eyes. The man who was used to quick answers in meetings, to controlling markets, to dominating every room he entered, now found himself unable to react. His daughter, his only heir, his public pride, was alive not because of him, but because of the woman he most despised. The silence of the guests around him became unbearable, as if every glance were a mirror reflecting his failure. Richard's chest tightened, a mix of dread, shame, and disbelief. How had he not noticed his daughter's absence? How had he allowed her to come so close to death? For the first time in years, he couldn't hide his fragility behind the mask of arrogance. The weight of his negligence crashed down on him like a crushing wave. As he watched Isabella holding Emily, Richard began to feel something he rarely experienced: gratitude mixed with humiliation. He had always believed money could buy everything: safety, respect, status, but in that moment he realized how wrong he had been. No contract, no mansion, no $1 million stock could bring back his daughter's life if Isabella hadn't acted. His mind began to replay every moment he had treated her as invisible, as worthless. Every harsh word, every public humiliation now pressed on his conscience like a crushing burden. For the first time, Richard began to see how his arrogance had blinded him, driving him away not only from his employees, but from his own daughter. Emily, now clinging desperately to the maid, made it painfully clear with her gesture that she found in Isabella something she had never found in him: true safety. The investors, still present, exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered among themselves, others merely observed, but all knew they were witnessing something far greater than a business meeting. Richard, feeling their eyes on him, tried to regain his composure, but his voice faltered when he attempted to call his daughter. Emily simply refused to let go of Isabella, ignoring her father completely. That silent rejection hurt more than any word could. In that simple act, the child revealed a truth Richard had never wanted to admit. He was a stranger to his own daughter. Meanwhile, Isabella, still drenched and exhausted, continued to comfort Emily with tender care. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. His pride, his armor of coldness and power, began to crack. For the first time he felt small, smaller than everyone around him, because true greatness stood before him, dressed in a blue uniform, with calloused hands, but a heart strong enough to save lives. That night, the mansion felt different. The silence was no longer the ordinary silence of routine, but an emptiness that echoed in Richard's heart. The guests had left early, embarrassed by the incident, and the house, though still lit by golden chandeliers, seemed cloaked in shadows. Richard remained in his office for hours, seated before contracts that once would have filled him with pride but now meant nothing. Each page felt worthless against the memory of his daughter nearly drowning. What hurt even more was the image of her clinging to Isabella, ignoring him as if he were not trustworthy. For the first time in many years, Richard faced the truth. He was not the strong man he believed himself to be, but someone fragile, incapable of offering love even to the one who needed it most. The weight of that realization fell on him like a sentence, forcing him to reflect on every choice he had made up to that point. The next morning, Richard came down the stairs earlier than usual. He found Isabella already at work, as always, quietly collecting the dishes left from the night before. He stopped in front of her, and for a few seconds he couldn't say a word. His pride still tried to resist, but something greater forced him to act. Gratitude. "Isabella," he began, but his voice faltered. The maid lifted her eyes, surprised to hear her name spoken so gently from his lips. "Yesterday, if it weren't for you, I would have lost the most precious thing I have." Silence lingered. Isabella didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him with serenity, without resentment. At that moment, Richard felt a strange relief. For the first time, he wasn't standing before a servant, but before a woman who had given him a lesson in humanity. The simple act of apologizing felt like climbing a mountain, but he knew it was necessary. In the days that followed, small changes began to unfold. Richard started to see Emily differently, spending more time with her, asking about her drawings, sitting beside her in the garden. Each smile from his daughter felt like a greater prize than any signed contract. Isabella, always present, continued her work with humility, but she noticed that Richard's gaze had changed. He no longer treated her as invisible. He greeted her in the mornings, thanked her for small tasks, and even asked about Matteo, showing genuine interest. The staff, astonished, whispered among themselves that they had never seen Richard act this way. It wasn't an overnight transformation, nor was it perfect, but it was real, born out of shame and gratitude. For the first time in years, Richard didn't seem like just a millionaire surrounded by luxury, but a father trying to relearn the meaning of love, and a man willing to admit that true worth lies not in power, but in humanity. Weeks had passed since the pool incident, yet the impact of that day still echoed within the Coleman mansion. The once cold and rigid atmosphere seemed to gradually come alive through small gestures that once would have been unthinkable. Emily smiled more, ran through the garden with the lightness her age demanded, and no longer carried so much weight in her eyes. Richard, though still on a long journey of transformation, devoted more time to his daughter, trying to fill the void he had left in her life. Isabella, as quiet as ever, continued her duties, but now she was seen in a new light. She was no longer just the maid, but the woman who had saved the family's heiress, the unseen guardian who had become indispensable. The respect she now received from the household staff reflected the new place she had earned, not through demand, but through merit. Richard began inviting Isabella into moments he would never have considered before. He asked her to accompany Emily to doctor's appointments, trusting in her ability to care for the girl. He allowed his daughter to call her to play in the garden or listen to bedtime stories. Emily, in turn, seemed to have found in Isabella the protective figure she had longed for. Between them existed an unbreakable bond, built not by blood, but by courage and compassion. Richard knew that no matter how hard he tried, he could never erase years of coldness, but he could choose to be different from that moment on. Each time he looked at Isabella, he saw not just the humble woman he had hired, but someone who had shown him the true meaning of greatness. At last, he had learned that wealth is not measured in numbers, but in actions. And so, in that home where once a frozen silence reigned, a new melody began to play. The melody of gratitude, respect, and transformation. Isabella continued her journey with quiet strength, knowing her life was still far from easy, but certain she had made a difference where she least expected. Emily, at just 5 years old, already knew how to recognize who truly loved her. And Richard, though still a millionaire and respected in business, had discovered something far more valuable than contracts or stocks: the worth of humanity. The mansion in Newport Hills would never be the same again, not because of renovations or wealth, but because within its walls something greater than luxury had been reborn. Love had been reborn. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you won't miss a new video, and of course, leave your like. It truly helps us keep bringing more emotional stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support.